Well, hello everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you once again. And I'm here with Surjit Bhalla, who's a senior India analyst at the Observatory Group and also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council in India. He's an academic and an author, and we're very lucky to have him for a few hours with us here at IE. So thank you for finding the time for this.
My pleasure, absolutely.
It's a real luxury to have somebody with so much knowledge about the Indian economy. So my first question has to do with just the overview of the Indian economy. Where do you see the economy headed? Where do you see the major sources of growth and the major headwinds? Just a general assessment of where you see the economy of the country right now.
As it happens that the Indian economy today, the economy is in the best position it's ever been, the macro economy. And I've been making that point for some time now, but just yesterday, Bimal Jalan, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, stated the same. Our inflation rate is now comparable to most developing countries, it's somewhere in the region of 4%, and our GDP growth rate is somewhere in the region of 7.5% and going upwards. So the Modi government has been able to bring about or introduce several economic reforms, and they're beginning to pay off. There is, within any economic transformation, the first issue that comes up is where is the source of growth going to be? Well, in India, just removing the obstacles is a big source of growth. And that is what is beginning. That is what has happened over the last 4 years, and that will continue to happen. Lots of low-hanging fruit.
On that point, and I want to link this to your book, The New Wealth of Nations, where you focus to a great extent on education, the role of education in human capital. And the first is a fairly broad question, but you claim in the book that actually understanding economic development through the lens of human capital development and education is very important. What is new in that take? Because of course, economic development theories have focused on human capital development for a long time. So what is new about your
this
work?
was while writing the book, this was a little bit of a discovery for me. Though I've been pursuing the human capital side of the story since early 1970s when I was a graduate student. And I wrote a paper then called 1971 or 72 called the Education Income Connection. Now, the point of that reference is that it will come as a shock to most people that economists did not think that education had any role in determining your income. Now, you know that your income is determined by education. I know that my income is determined by education.
Well, we make a living in this place
Yes.
because of that relation.
But it was until Gary Becker came on the scene that he introduced the notion that maybe education was a factor in determining your income and the major factor. So I think it's very useful to remember that there were three Nobel laureates who wrote their books in 1960s or thereabouts at the time, and some earlier, Arthur Lewis on unlimited supplies of unskilled labor, and there's Kuznets, and there's Gunnar Myrdal, and all of them, and Gunnar Myrdal, poor guy, stands out as the most unfortunate predictor because he had said that Asia was doomed. Including obviously India and China. And why? Because Asia didn't have any natural resources. Latin America would do very well, and Sub-Saharan Africa would do very well because they were rich in diamonds and natural resources. So, we take it, this is how much the world has changed. We take it for granted, obviously. It's the most obvious thing. Sure. But as I state in my book, my definition of genius is something that is obvious ex post. So I think in that sense, very much Gary Becker was an absolute genius.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that there's a tension in your book with another trend. So if human capital and education are central, because you educate people, they can do more sophisticated work, they can move to more sort of value-added employment, and you move from very primary sector dependent economies to secondary, then services and others. So that's sort of the traditional narrative. Now today we find ourselves in this world where you have enormous technological change, and one of the impacts of that change seems to be the hollowing out of a lot of jobs that we consider fairly sophisticated. This is what we're seeing in the West, and we're seeing a lot of automation of white-collar services jobs in the legal industry, in the banking industry, in journalism, you name it. So how do these two things match? Do you think that indeed the latest wave of technological change, particularly with AI, deep learning, and a few others, do you think it hinders, it undoes, it decouples that relationship between human capital and development? Because maybe what you need is just to focus almost entirely on technological development and pickup, and the development of human capital is no longer going to be that central because education is not going to be that central.
Well, you raise important issues, but let me, you mentioned very correctly technological development, and I can't see technological development coming out without education. I mean, the guys who bring about technological change are very, very educated or have high amounts of human capital. It's not formal schooling that one means by education, but it is ability and, ability to, which has the attribute or which has the accompaniment of education. So I don't, but let me address the point about artificial intelligence. I've, like any economist, I have never felt that technology displaces employment. I remember in the 60s and 70s when the high-yielding varieties of rice and wheat were introduced in India, which meant that people will have greater use of tractors, and people said that, oh my God, this is going to cause a real problem. Take, for example, Uber and these taxi services. Suddenly they increase the demand for drivers. Now, but you will now say, and correctly, what about driverless cars? We are long, long away from that happening. But I will acknowledge, and I do agree, that the problem is going to be more acute in the West than in developing countries, but also developing countries or emerging economies will face this problem. We are entering into a new era. I call it the Brave New World. And it won't be without its problems. And you've mentioned very important.
And I'll ask you, I want to ask you about how education and human capital looks in this environment. But before I go there, because you said something that I think is very important and interesting, you said that the pain will be maybe more acute, or the challenge will be greater for developed economies when it comes to managing technological change. But when I look at developing economies, I see something that worries me a great deal, which is this idea of this premature deindustrialization, this idea that we're seeing automation in industrial employment at much lower levels of income per capita than we saw in Germany and Japan. So if the West has a challenge, which we do, not the West, if developed economies have a challenge now, which basically means we have to train people for jobs that we're still unsure how they're going to look, they're going to be maybe more detached from the production of goods and services than jobs that we currently understand. So maybe there's a fourth sector beyond services. There's this idea of the empathy economy. We just don't know. But if you're sitting in a developing economy, not only do you have to train people for those jobs that you're uncertain of, but the ladder, the traditional ladder, the entire middle of, so the secondary sector as a development ladder is sort of evaporating. So you're in China and Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines, you're seeing this happening. So you're going to have to find a way to train people that are the daughters of people that are in the primary sector to become engineers of the Internet of Things. I don't know how you do that.
Okay. My very good friend Robert Lawrence, professor at Harvard, has been doing this study on deindustrialization for the last 20, 30 years. And, he's documented how in the US, there's been a complete trend line decline in industrial employment. And this is going on since 1960. It's not something recent. And I'm sure the same thing has been going on in Europe post the Reconstruction, so post 1960, 1970. So, you know, we will, so I think the job loss due to industrialization or premature industrialization is somewhat overstated. There is accompanying, and in this sense, India might have been, and maybe it applies most to China, which took advantage of introducing some sound economic policies and really going into manufacturing in a huge way. India, for reasons of being Indian, we didn't take advantage, but maybe there was one blessing. We went more into services.
Right.
So we won't face this deindustrialization because not much industrial employment to begin with.
Yeah, right.
But, you know, but I think it's services, software, you know, each time you have, you know, technology has always been, right from the time of the Luddites, right? And that, you know, labor displacing, and hasn't turned out. But, you know, one thing, if I take the argument to its logical extreme in my book, and I do that, let's assume that what is going to happen over the future, that education quality is going to go up steadily in the emerging countries. So let's think, you know, everybody has access to the same education in terms of quality as well as quantity. What's going to happen? And what that means is that, one, the distribution of income is going to be a lot more equal, okay, because ability is distributed much more equally. But at the same time, there will be people who will be lost out in the race. You know, one of the, it's not a side effect actually, one of the major conclusions in the book is that women are going to be the most advantaged by this change, because now there's nothing to differentiate between men and women if they have the same education. So, you know, but there will be people who lose out, both in the developed economies and in emerging economies, and that's why I argue that maybe we should begin to think of a new welfare order where, you know, it's not, I want to emphasize, not universal basic income, but some form of basic income, negative income tax, so that people in the people of the top 60-70% can afford to finance this basic income for. So the world is not going to be without problems, but you know, it's hunger is no longer a problem in most parts of the world. Transportation would be, but we'll have problems, but the world will be a much better place.
Let me ask you a final question. On the education piece. So you have this enormous change in the jobs landscape. Maybe it's not net negative in terms of total numbers of jobs, but definitely there's going to be a change in the nature of particularly of tasks, but also of entire job categories. So how do you see that from India, and what sort of education policy do you think is needed to construct the right human capital to ride this wave? So that, you know, this question on the future of education for us is central in this institution. We've thought about it a great deal. How do you think that looks moving forward?
Yeah, I've looked at this problem, you know, and it seems like of all places, the most unexpected, maybe the most unexpected, is Finland. They're doing, I think, some really innovative, excellent work on education. And the way they've organized, you know, teaching, I think you at the Institute of Education, I think the way we teach has to change. And that's what Finland is doing. So the teachers and traditional teaching has been oriented towards the best students in the class, which is completely wrong. And it should be aimed at the middle and at the bottom. the bright students can take care of themselves. You don't need to teach them much, as everybody knows. So I think one big change is the way we think about teaching will come about, is coming about. As I mentioned, in Finland, it's starting. And within 10, 15 years, another aspect which is already changing is technology is now, for example, if you're a student in India or in any poor country, you have access to your education style as well as content, most importantly. It's freer.
And so this is more on the pedagogy and the tools, right? But on the substance, do you see any major changes on the sorts of skills, the sorts of issues? There's this big questioning, right? Of if we understand education as a mere exercise of transfer of information, then education is doomed, right? Because information, the cost of information has collapsed, and it's now readily available, so we have to move to transfer skills.
Not how to use education.
Do you buy that argument? Or?
No. But I think, look, education, let's take it in the broadest sense, is first the incorporation of or use of knowledge, where to look for knowledge. Previously, we had to go to the libraries, and now we go to our little mobile and get, the whole workforce is going to be a lot more educated because of now technology. The content, so I think a fair amount of it has
better informed.
Huh?
Yeah, they're going to be better informed.
They're going to be better informed.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Everything isn't, or most things are in the positive direction. But I do think how we, traditionally it was, put students in a class and gave a lecture, and you started off with practically nobody going to college, then starts this. So by definition you got, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit. So it didn't matter how you taught. Okay. Now it's going to matter, I think, how we learn and how we are made to learn will make a big difference. Because as you just said, the information is there available to everybody, but can they all process it as efficiently? Certainly there won't be equality because human ability will be different. Gene structure, whatever causes thinking, that will be there. But I think we'll be able to, so I go more for the pedagogy, that how you teach, I think, is where innovation is needed and possibly will arrive.
Well, it's fascinating times to be in academia.
I think so, absolutely.
And in the world of education, enormous challenges. But thank you for finding the time for this.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And I hope you enjoy the rest of the visit to Spain.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.